I didn't think much of it at first, the flicker of recognition on Michelle's face as she laughed at a joke from a guy I didn't know at our neighbor's barbecue. She was radiant that night, glowing in a sundress she hadn't worn in years, her laugh a little too loud, her smile lingering a little too long. But it was just a party, and I had no reason to suspect anything. Not yet, anyway. Things started to unravel 2 weeks later. Our 10-year-old daughter, Chloe, came home from school clutching a red envelope, her face lit up like Christmas morning. "Daddy, Daddy," she cried. "Mom's going to be the queen of the dance." "The what now?" I asked, pulling her up onto the couch beside me. Chloe explained, with the detail only a child could provide, how her school was hosting a spring-themed parent-kid dance. The PTA had chosen Michelle as their honorary chairwoman for the event. "She's so popular." Chloe beamed. Popular. I couldn't help but smile at that. Michelle had always been effortlessly charming, the type who could strike up a conversation with a stranger and leave them feeling like they'd known her forever. It wasn't a surprise the other parents adored her. Still, something about Chloe's enthusiasm caught me off guard. "Did Mom tell you this?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "Nope," she replied. "Miss Anderson told me." "Mom didn't say anything." "Why not?" That was a good question. It wasn't like Michelle to keep something like that to herself. She loved Chloe to bits and would normally jump at the chance to celebrate something together. So why hadn't she mentioned it? The question lingered in the back of my mind until the day of the dance. I'd offered to drive them there, but Michelle insisted they'd meet me at the school. "It's more convenient," she said with a smile, her tone a little too breezy. She was stunning that night, her dress hugging her in a way that made me remember our early days of dating. But when I kissed her on the cheek, she turned away just slightly, enough for the kiss to land awkwardly near her ear. That's when the pit in my stomach first formed. The school gym was buzzing with parents and kids, the smell of punch and floor polish mixing with the sound of cheesy pop hits blaring through the speakers. Chloe dragged me toward the dance floor, and we laughed and spun around until we were both dizzy. That's when I saw him. A tall, lean man with salt and pepper hair, wearing a navy suit that was too sharp for a school function. He stood in the corner, his eyes trained on Michelle as she moved through the crowd, her laugh bright and her hand occasionally brushing his arm. She looked different with him. Relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in years, like she was letting go of a piece of herself she kept tightly locked away. They didn't notice me watching at first. But then he whispered something in her ear, and she turned her head to look right at me. Her face froze for just a second, long enough for me to see something flicker behind her eyes. Guilt? Fear? Whatever it was gone in a flash, replaced by the smooth mask of a smile. She waved at me from across the room, her fingers brushing his sleeve as she did. He didn't move, didn't try to hide his presence, as though he had every right to be there. And maybe he did. For now. That was the moment I knew. Something wasn't right. I spent the rest of the dance trying to focus on Chloe. She was oblivious, twirling to the music and laughing with her friends. My eyes kept drifting to Michelle and the man in the suit. They were careful, standing apart when people passed by, their body language casual but just too synchronized. When Chloe begged me for another spin on the dance floor, I agreed, keeping them in my peripheral vision the entire time. By the end of the night, I still hadn't approached them. Confronting Michelle in public wasn't my style. I needed more. As we walked to the car, Michelle seemed unusually quiet. Chloe, clutching her little tiara from the dance, chatted away in the back seat, filling the silence. When we got home, Michelle kissed Chloe goodnight and headed upstairs, leaving me to lock up. That was when I decided I needed to dig deeper. The next day, I volunteered to drop Chloe off at her gymnastics class. It gave me an hour alone to think and come up with a plan. Sitting in the car outside the gym, I scrolled through the list of contacts in Michelle's phone on our shared family plan. It was a list I hadn't looked at in years, but now it felt like a lifeline. I scanned the names for anything unfamiliar or out of place. There it was, Anthony L. A name that hadn't appeared in our life before, with call logs showing regular communication over the past 3 months. I didn't jump to conclusions yet. It could be harmless. A client, maybe. A colleague. But it gnawed at me that she hadn't mentioned him, not once. I called a friend of mine, Matt, who works in IT. We met years ago when he fixed a company laptop, and since then, he'd been my go-to tech guy. I asked him if he could pull some data for me just to see if this Anthony was who I thought he might be. He hesitated. You sure about this, David? Once you go digging, you might not like what you find. I'm already not liking it, I said flatly. He agreed to help. A day later, Matt sent me an email with Anthony's full name and work profile. Anthony Lawson, marketing consultant. I clicked on his LinkedIn profile and saw the same salt and pepper man from the dance. There it was in black and white, he'd been consulting for Michelle's company for over a year. The unease in my gut turned into a cold, sharp certainty. Still, I needed something concrete before confronting her. Something irrefutable. That night, while Michelle was in the shower, I searched through her work bag under the guise of looking for a receipt for a shared expense. In a side pocket, I found a crumpled flyer for an upcoming seminar downtown. Anthony Lawson was listed as one of the keynote speakers. The seminar was scheduled for the following weekend, and Michelle had conveniently mentioned she'd be working late. It didn't sit right with me. I decided I'd attend the seminar myself. Officially, I'd tell her I was heading out for errands, but in reality, I'd be watching. Saturday morning arrived, and Michelle left the house looking every bit the professional executive: sleek blouse, tailored pants, heels that clicked against the hardwood floor. She kissed me goodbye but avoided holding my gaze for long. After she left, I waited 30 minutes before grabbing my jacket and heading out. The seminar was held at a downtown hotel, a venue I'd been to for conferences in the past. I walked in, pretending to check emails on my phone, and scanned the room. It wasn't hard to spot her. Michelle stood near the entrance to one of the smaller meeting rooms, chatting with a group of attendees. Anthony wasn't in sight, but I knew he'd show up eventually. I kept a safe distance, blending into the crowd as best I could. Finally, Anthony appeared, striding into the room with the kind of confidence that made people turn their heads. Michelle's face lit up when she saw him. They greeted each other like old friends, no overt affection, but a familiarity that didn't sit right. They stayed close during the presentation, whispering occasionally, their heads tilted toward one another. The break between sessions came, and the two of them left together, slipping out of the room while the rest of the attendees mingled. I followed, careful to stay far enough behind that they wouldn't notice me. They walked toward the elevators, talking quietly, until Anthony pressed the button. When the doors opened, they stepped inside together. I watched the elevator doors close and stared at the panel displaying the floors. They stopped on the 14th. That was it. No more doubts, no more assumptions. I waited a few minutes before taking the stairs. By the time I reached the 14th floor, I was out of breath but determined. I walked down the hallway, scanning the numbers on the doors, until I saw it, room 1408. The Do Not Disturb sign hung on the doorknob. I leaned against the wall, my heart pounding. This was the confirmation I needed, and yet I couldn't bring myself to knock or burst in. Instead, I pulled out my phone and took a picture of the door, the room number, the signed proof I could use later if it came to that. When I finally made it back home, Michelle was there, acting as if nothing had happened. She was in the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of wine. "Long day," she said casually, without looking at me. "Yeah," I replied, my voice tight. "Very long." The air between us felt heavy, charged with unspoken tension. I didn't confront her then. Not yet. I needed to figure out what to say and how to say it. More than anything, I needed time to process what I'd just discovered. And Michelle? She had no idea that the life we'd built together was already beginning to crumble. By the following evening, I was done pretending everything was normal. The house felt suffocating, every glance Michelle threw my way layered with meaning I didn't want to interpret. She laughed with the kids at dinner, talked about her day like it was just another Tuesday, but every word sounded hollow to me. I sat there, silent, spooning half-warm pasta into my mouth and feeling like an outsider in my own family. After we tucked the kids into bed, I made my move. Michelle was in the living room, scrolling on her laptop with a glass of wine at her side. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her. She was so absorbed she didn't notice me at first. "Michelle," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. She looked up, startled. "Yeah? We need to talk." Her eyes flicked to the laptop screen, then back to me. "Okay," she said slowly, closing the lid. "What's going on?" I sat down on the armrest of the couch, leaving a careful distance between us. "You want to tell me what's been going on with you and Anthony Lawson?" Her face froze, like I'd hit pause on a movie. Then she blinked, her expression shifting to one of confusion. "Anthony? From work?" "Yes," I said firmly. "From work. The guy you spent all day with yesterday at the seminar. In room 1408. The color drained from her face. For a moment, she said nothing, just stared at me like I'd spoken a foreign language. "What are you talking about?" she stammered, though her tone was less indignant than I'd expected. "You know exactly what I'm talking about," I replied. "I saw you two leave together. I saw you get in the elevator. I saw the 'Do Not Disturb' sign on the door." Her mouth opened, then closed. She seemed to struggle with her words, like a swimmer flailing for the surface. Finally, she found her voice. "It's not what you think," she said, her tone defensive but not angry. "Then explain it," I said, crossing my arms. Michelle stood up, pacing the room as she spoke. "Look, Anthony and we've been working on this big project together for months. It's been stressful, and yeah, we've had to spend a lot of time together. But it's not what you think. Nothing happened." I let out a short laugh, more bitter than amused. "Nothing happened? You expect me to believe that? After the way you've been acting for weeks? After you lied to me about working late?" "I didn't lie," she shot back. "I was working late. It's just complicated." "Complicated," I repeated. "That's your defense? It's complicated?" Her face flushed with anger now. "Yes, complicated. Not that you'd understand. You've been so checked out lately, David. Do you even know what's been going on with me? With work? With us?" "Oh, don't even try to turn this around on me," I snapped. "You're the one sneaking around with some guy from work, not me." She stopped pacing and turned to face me, her arms crossed. "I'm not sneaking around. Anthony is a friend. That's it." "A friend who you're sharing hotel rooms with?" "I didn't share a hotel room with him," she yelled, her voice breaking. "So what? You just stepped out of a seminar to hang out in his hotel room. Alone?" She hesitated, her lips pressed tightly together. "We were talking," she said finally, her voice quieter. "Talking," I said. "Right. Because that's what married women do with their friends in private hotel rooms." Michelle's shoulders sagged, and for the first time, she looked genuinely upset. "It wasn't like that," she said softly. "I just needed someone to talk to. Someone who listens." I stared at her, feeling a mixture of anger and disbelief. "You have someone to talk to?" "Me. Your husband." "You," she said bitterly. "You haven't really listened to me in years, David. All you care about is your work and your routines. Do you even know how lonely I've been?" Her words hit me like a slap, but I refused to let them distract me. "This isn't about me," I said. "This is about you, and the choices you've made. And right now, I want the truth. Have you been having an affair with Anthony Lawson?" She looked away, biting her lip. The silence stretched on, thick and unbearable. Finally, she spoke. "No," she said. "Not exactly." "Not exactly?" I repeated, my voice rising. "What the hell does that mean?" She sat down on the couch, burying her face in her hands. "It means, we've been close. Too close. But we haven't." I cut her off. "Don't. Just don't." I don't want to hear your excuses. It's not an excuse, she said, looking up at me with tear-filled eyes. It's the truth. I've made mistakes, but I haven't crossed that line. I swear. I shook my head, standing up. Do you even hear yourself right now? You're trying to convince me that it's okay because you didn't cross the line. But you've been lying to me, sneaking around, prioritizing him over your own family. How is that not crossing the line? She didn't answer, just sat there staring at the floor. I can't do this, I said, my voice trembling with rage and heartbreak. I can't live like this, wondering if the person I married is lying to me every time she walks out the door. Michelle stood up, reaching for my hand. David, please, she said. I know I've hurt you. I know I've broken your trust. But we can fix this. We can go to counseling, work through it together. Please don't throw everything away over one mistake. I pulled my hand away, my throat tight with emotion. You already threw it away, Michelle. The moment you chose him over us. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her standing there, tears streaming down her face. For the first time in our marriage, I felt like we were on completely opposite sides, with no way to bridge the gap. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. My mind was a mess, replaying Michelle's words from the night before. Too close. Not exactly. I couldn't stop hearing her say it, couldn't stop imagining all the possibilities. She thought she hadn't crossed a line? She'd obliterated it. I spent hours in my home office, staring at the wall, trying to figure out what to do next. Divorce felt inevitable, but that wasn't enough. Michelle had shattered the life we built, betrayed the trust one thought was unshakable. If she was going to destroy everything, I wasn't about to let her walk away unscathed. By the afternoon, I had a plan. I didn't want to lose my kids or let Michelle manipulate the narrative. I needed to act decisively. The first step was gathering evidence. The doorbell rang, breaking my train of thought. It was Matt, my IT friend. I had asked him for another favor, and he'd come through. He handed me a small device, something that looked like a USB drive. This is it, Matt said. Plug it into her laptop when she's not around. It'll clone her hard drive in less than 10 minutes. Once that's done, I can dig through her emails, photos, and files for anything incriminating. I nodded. Thanks, Matt. I owe you big time. He hesitated, glancing at me. You sure you want to go down this road, David? This kind of thing can get ugly fast. It's already ugly, I replied. I just need to make sure I'm not blindsided by whatever's next. That night, while Michelle was putting the kids to bed, I slipped into the living room and plugged the device into her laptop. It was terrifying how easy it was, like the universe wanted me to find the truth. The cloning process finished quickly, and I stashed the device in my desk drawer. The next morning, I handed it off to Matt, who promised to analyze it as soon as possible. I'll call you if I find anything, he said. But I wasn't done. My next move was more public. I knew Michelle's company was protective of its reputation, and Anthony Lawson was still a consultant for them. If their relationship had crossed any professional boundaries, I wanted her bosses to know about it. I drafted an anonymous email to the HR department. In it, I outlined what I'd witnessed at the seminar and mentioned that their interactions seemed inappropriate for a work setting. I attached a few photos I'd snapped of Michelle and Anthony at the hotel, enough to raise questions without outright accusations. I didn't expect an immediate response, but it felt good to hit send. Michelle thought she could lie to my face and walk away with her career intact? Not anymore. The following days were tense. Michelle acted like nothing had happened, going about her routine with forced cheerfulness. I played along, waiting for the fallout. Then, Matt called. David, you might want to sit down, he said. What did you find? Emails. Dozens of them. They're not explicit, but they're flirty as hell. And it's clear she's been meeting Anthony outside of work. There are calendar invites for lunches, drinks, and a few off-site brainstorming sessions. I felt my stomach churn. Anything else? A few texts were backed up on the laptop, too. Those are less ambiguous. He sent me screenshots of the messages. In one, Anthony wrote, "Last night was amazing. Can't stop thinking about you." Michelle had replied, "Me too. Wish we didn't have to sneak around like this." It was the confirmation I needed, though it made me feel like throwing up. I thanked Matt and hung up, staring at the evidence on my screen. This wasn't just emotional infidelity. It was physical. Now it was time to strike. I scheduled a meeting with my lawyer the next morning. I'd been thinking about divorce since the confrontation, but now I had the ammunition I needed to protect myself and the kids. My lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Linda, reviewed everything I brought her: texts, emails, photos. "This is solid," she said. "We can use this to argue for a favorable custody arrangement. And depending on how things shake out, you might not owe her a dime in alimony." "Good," I said. "I want her to feel the consequences of what she's done." Linda nodded. "Just be prepared for a fight. Affairs tend to bring out the worst in people, especially when kids are involved." After the meeting, I went home and started packing my things. I wasn't planning to leave the house entirely. Our home was legally mine, and I wasn't going to give it up without a fight, but I needed space to clear my head. I moved into the guest room and avoided Michelle as much as possible. A week later, the bomb dropped. Michelle came home from work looking pale and shaken. "What's wrong?" I asked casually, though I already knew. She hesitated, then said, I got called into HR today. Someone filed a complaint about me and Anthony." I raised an eyebrow. "Oh? They think we've been unprofessional," she said, her voice trembling. "David, this is serious. They're investigating, and if they find anything, I could lose my job." I leaned back in my chair, trying to hide my satisfaction. "Well, I'm sure you have nothing to hide. Right?" Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I thought she might come clean. But instead, she nodded silently and walked away. It wasn't long before the investigation expanded to Anthony, and rumors started spreading within the company. Michelle became paranoid, checking her phone constantly and snapping at the kids over minor things. Meanwhile, I stayed calm, biding my time. The final blow came when I filed for divorce. Michelle was served at work, in front of her colleagues. I'd asked Linda to include copies of the incriminating texts and emails in the filing, ensuring that Michelle's double life was laid bare for everyone to see. When she came home that night, she was livid. "How could you humiliate me like that?" she screamed, slamming the divorce papers on the kitchen counter. "You humiliated yourself," I said coldly. "I'm just making sure everyone sees you for who you really are." She stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of control returning to my life. Michelle had made her choices, and now she was reaping the consequences. But I wasn't done yet. There was still one more thing I needed to say before I could truly move on. It was a week after Michelle was served the divorce papers. The tension in the house was unbearable. The kids were starting to notice, asking why we weren't eating dinner together anymore or why I was sleeping in the guest room. I dodged their questions, promising that everything would be okay, but even I didn't know what that meant. That Friday night, after the kids had gone to bed, I decided it was time to have the conversation. The one where we stopped pretending there was anything left to salvage. Michelle was sitting on the couch, staring blankly at a muted TV. A glass of wine sat untouched on the coffee table. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, her posture slumped. It was a far cry from the confident woman I'd married, or even the woman I'd confronted 2 weeks ago. "Michelle," I said, walking into the room. She didn't look up. "What?" "We need to talk." She sighed and turned off the TV. "About what?" I sat down in the armchair across from her, keeping my tone steady. "About the divorce. About the kids. About what happens next." For a moment, she didn't respond. Then she leaned back, crossing her arms. "What's there to talk about? You've already made up your mind." "I have," I said. But we still need to figure out what this looks like. For them. For us. She scoffed. For us? There's no us anymore, David. You made that clear when you humiliated me at work. I felt a surge of anger but pushed it down. Don't pin this on me. You're the one who lied, who cheated, who. I didn't cheat, she interrupted, her voice sharp. I laughed bitterly. You didn't cheat? So those texts I found last night was amazing, what do you call that? Her face flushed, but she held her ground. I never slept with him. Stop lying, Michelle, I said, my voice rising. Just stop. I've seen enough to know the truth. She looked away, her jaw tightening. Fine, she said quietly. We kissed. Once. And yes, things got emotional. But it didn't go further than that. I stared at her, trying to gauge if she was telling the truth. You expect me to believe that? After everything? I don't care what you believe, she snapped. It's the truth. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything pressing down on us. Finally, I spoke. It doesn't matter, I said. Whether you slept with him or not, you still betrayed me. You betrayed our family. Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I thought she might apologize. But instead, she leaned forward, her expression angry. And what about you, David? You think you're innocent in all this? You think you've been the perfect husband? I never cheated on you, I said flatly. No, she said. You just ignored me. For years. You were so focused on work, on routines, on everything but me. Do you even remember the last time we had a real conversation? The last time you asked me how I was doing? Her words stung because there was some truth to them. I had been distant, wrapped up in my own world, assuming our marriage would take care of itself. But that didn't excuse what she'd done. You should have talked to me, I said. You should have told me how you were feeling instead of turning to someone else. I tried, she said, her voice breaking. But you weren't listening. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my emotions in check. Maybe I wasn't, I admitted. And I'll carry that. But what you did. I can't come back from that. I can't trust you anymore, Michelle. Her shoulders slumped, and she wiped at her eyes. So that's it? You're just done? 15 years, and you're ready to throw it all away? You threw it away, I said. The moment you let him into our life. She didn't respond, just stared at the floor. I don't hate you, I said after a long pause. I want you to know that. But I also can't stay married to you. Not after this. Tears streamed down her face, and she nodded slowly. What about the kids? She whispered. They'll be okay, I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. We'll figure out custody. I don't want to take them away from you, but I won't let them get caught in the middle of this, either. She looked up at me, her expression desperate. Can we at least try counseling? For them? For us? No, I said firmly. Counseling won't fix this. You broke something, Michelle. And it can't be put back together. Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I felt a pang of guilt. But I pushed it aside. This wasn't about punishing her. It was about protecting myself and our kids from more damage. I'll stay in the guest room until we figure out the logistics, I said, standing up. But we need to make this transition as smooth as possible for the kids. She nodded, her hands trembling. As I walked out of the room, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The weight of the past few weeks had lifted, if only slightly. For the first time, I felt like I could see a way forward, even if it wasn't the path I'd envisioned. It wasn't the end I'd wanted, but it was the one I needed. The next few weeks were a blur of lawyers, logistics, and raw emotions. Despite everything, Michelle and I managed to keep the kids insulated from the worst of it. They knew something was wrong, the shift in energy between us was impossible to hide, but we agreed not to share the details until everything was finalized. I focused on structure. Mornings were for the kids, breakfast, packing lunches, and getting them to school. Afternoons meant work and meetings with Linda, my lawyer, to strategize the divorce proceedings. Evenings were the hardest. Sitting at the dinner table with the kids while Michelle and I avoided eye contact felt like navigating a minefield. It was a Wednesday night when I finally broke the news to Chloe and Ethan. Michelle and I sat across from them in the living room, the weight of the conversation settling between us. "Kids," I began, my voice steady, "your mom and I need to talk to you about something important." Chloe, always the sensitive one, immediately looked worried. Ethan, younger and more oblivious, just glanced between us with curiosity. "We've decided that we're not going to be married anymore," I said. "We're getting a divorce." Chloe's eyes welled up instantly. "What? Why?" Ethan just frowned. "Does that mean you're leaving?" Michelle spoke up, her voice softer than I'd heard it in weeks. "No, sweetheart. Neither of us is leaving you. We both love you very much, and that's never going to change. But your dad and I, we're better off living apart." The questions came fast and furious after that. Would they still live in the same house? Would they still go to the same school? Would we still celebrate holidays together? I answered each one as honestly as I could, reassuring them where possible. "You'll still see both of us all the time," I said. "We'll make sure of that." Chloe, ever perceptive, pressed harder. "But why? Why can't you just fix it?" Michelle's face crumpled, but she stayed quiet. I took a deep breath. Sometimes, when people are married, they stop being able to make each other happy. And when that happens, it's better for everyone if they live apart. Chloe wasn't satisfied, but she didn't push further. Ethan just nodded, clearly not fully understanding. That night, after they'd gone to bed, I sat alone in the guest room, trying to process everything. I knew I'd done the right thing for myself and for the kids, but the reality of dismantling a 15-year marriage wasn't easy to accept. The following week, Michelle moved out. She found a rental house not far from the kids' school, which made the transition easier for them. The first night without her in the house felt surreal. It wasn't that I missed her, I'd already let go of whatever feelings I once had, but the absence was palpable. I threw myself into creating a new routine. I adjusted to single parenting on the days the kids were with me, discovering how to juggle work, school drop-offs, and dinner prep without a partner. It was exhausting, but it was also empowering. Meanwhile, the divorce proceedings marched on. Michelle initially fought for joint custody but eventually agreed to let me have primary custody of the kids. I think she knew she didn't have the energy to fight me in court, especially with her career still in limbo after the fallout with Anthony. Speaking of Anthony, he didn't come out of this unscathed either. I heard through the grapevine that his consulting contract with Michelle's company wasn't renewed. Apparently, the HR investigation uncovered enough inappropriate behavior to make him a liability. For weeks, I wondered if Michelle would try to rebuild her relationship with him now that we were separated. But from what I could tell, she'd cut ties completely. Maybe she realized he wasn't worth the destruction he'd caused. Or maybe she was just too ashamed to face him. One evening, after the divorce was finalized, Michelle called me. "David," she began, her voice hesitant. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. For everything." I didn't respond right away. Part of me wanted to unload every ounce of anger I still carried, to make her feel the full weight of what she'd done. But another part of me, the part that wanted to move on, stopped me. "I appreciate that," I said finally. There was a long pause. "I never wanted it to end like this," she said. "Neither did I," I replied. "But this is where we are. All we can do now is focus on the kids and try to give them the best life possible." She agreed, and we ended the call on a note that felt neutral. Not closure, exactly, but the closest thing to it I was going to get. In the months that followed, life slowly began to settle into a new normal. The kids adapted to the shared custody arrangement better than I'd expected, and I found myself rediscovering parts of my identity I'd lost over the years. I started working out again, reconnected with old friends, and even began exploring new hobbies. One day, while sorting through old files on my computer, I came across the folder of evidence I'd gathered against Michelle. Texts, emails, photos. Proof of her betrayal. I stared at it for a long time before finally deleting it. It didn't matter anymore. The divorce had stripped away everything that wasn't essential, leaving me with a clearer sense of who I was and what I wanted. I wasn't interested in revenge or dwelling on the past. My focus was on the future, on being the best father I could be and building a life that felt authentic. As for Michelle, I didn't know what her future held. And for the first time, I realized I didn't need to. The story of us was over. And for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to start writing a new one.